Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to welcome everyone today and to introduce this United Europe and GLOBSEC joint panel discussion on AI and cybersecurity. In the first round, we will explore the challenges that AI present and discuss the risks associated with the further increases in its usage. We are delighted to welcome Raquel Jorge, a policy analyst on the technology and digital agenda at the Elcano Royal Institute. Mr. Mikhail Kokorich, CEO and founder of Destinus, an aerospace technology company working to develop a hyperplane. Rastislav, Janota, director of the National Cybersecurity Center in Slovakia, and we're hoping, normally he was confirmed, Dr. Rytis may join us. I think he's under pressure at the moment, and he's the director of the National Cybersecurity Center at the Lithuanian Ministry of National Defense. As I said, this is a joint cooperation between GLOBSEC and United Europe. The format is that we're going to have two panels, one starting right now, which will introduce the challenges associated with the subject. There'll be a short break, and then there will be a second panel to follow up with my colleague from GLOBSEC, Mr. Roland, who will introduce himself later. Following the introduction of the speakers, I'll give a short introduction of the themes, and there will be a possibility for people from the audience to ask some questions, and also for people online to ask some questions via the Slido app that you've been informed of. To get into it, artificial intelligence is seen as a thing in the future, but we're hearing more and more of it every day, and it has been integrated in systems that affect our daily lives. Everything from search engines and virtual assistants and translation software, all the way through to healthcare and transportation and other things that are supposed to make our life easier, although anyone who's faced with a malfunctioning ATM or something similar might not relate. And as the technology becomes more and more advanced and integrated into life, of course, it becomes more and more a weakness and an opening for cyber threats. So we need to be aware of the challenges that the AI as is integrated in our daily lives and through cybersecurity. And what do we mean when we talk about cybersecurity? We're sort of thinking of the metaverse as is so famous at the moment, with the online and digital world, or teenage hackers in sweaty bedrooms. But actually, the Internet of Things is connecting real-world objects that participate in our daily lives, such as automated gateways in the metro, or passport control, or even traffic lights, or drones can be targeted by cybersecurity threat actors. And when we hear about artificial intelligence, we're maybe inclined to think of humanoid robots, the like of Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, that sort of thing. But actually, a lot of it is deployed over platforms in the form of algorithms and machine learning that guide the use of those algorithms. And they're often used interchangeably, but the way that they learn new information differs, and the way that they relate to the world differs. So machine learning informing algorithms just derived from data, following an instruction set to pick up and learn from that data, whereas some other forms of AI are handcrafted by human programmers and have a slightly different profile, shall we say. But then, of course, learning from data introduces the notion of bias, and it can come from bias in the data set itself, or the handcrafted software can actually pick up the bias of its own human creator, if you like. So those biases. But biases are one thing. We're approaching a world where AI is now being involved in military operations, and military leaders are interested in using advancements in AI to perform tasks where humans are less adept, because sometimes where AI is actually more adept, because sometimes the decisions or sometimes the data that needs to be interpreted and digested, it needs to be done at a wicked fast pace. And that becomes an issue when we talk about autonomous weaponry, which has been and is deployed in the field right now. We know it happens through drones, and that's common knowledge. And those drones currently are generally operated by human operators, but it is possible for them to be operated autonomously following instructions that are built into an AI that is on board, and sometimes not even connected to a home base. And the question then involves: do we give those AIs the discretion to end a human life. We've seen how the discretion to end human life given to an operator based in Oklahoma, continents away from his or her target, leads to serious ethical questions. You know, what happens if we go another step and the disassociation from the ending of a human life is delegated to an AI? And if those systems are compromised, would anybody notice in time to intervene? So these are issues that courts are grappling with on a smaller scale. One can imagine the notion of Tesla's AI having to make a decision over whether or not to kill the older pedestrian whose life is almost ran, or the small child whose life is yet to begin, and the way that societies and different societies value those lives relative to each other. Difficult ethical questions. So with all of these factors in mind, today's leaders are tasked with drafting appropriate legislation and preparing for the future threats of AI in the field of cybersecurity and elsewhere, and that is what we're here to discuss today. So if I could turn to you, Raquel, first, if you could maybe take 3 or 4 minutes to make your opening pitch, followed by the other two gentlemen, Mr. Kokorich and Mr. Janota, and then we'll be taking questions either from the floor here or from Slido. So Raquel, please.
Thanks. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to GLOBSEC and as well as United Europe, and I am very glad to see people from different countries because it always allows the European Union to have different voices, different experiences, and also different expertise. So I would like to talk specifically about the issue of, as we are gathered and convened here to talk on, about the nexus between AI and cybersecurity. And I see that much of the discussion has, generally speaking today, has been centered on how beneficial machine learning algorithms may be for identifying and defending against computer-based vulnerabilities and threats by automating the detection and response to cyber attacks, if any. But there is always another side of the coin, which is how AI may be used for offensive attacks, and how AI may make cyber attacks increasingly difficult to be detected, to be blocked, to be defended against other actors. So in this regard, first of all, I would like to talk about 3 types of actions that may be developed through the AI and nexus, AI and cyber nexus, and which may be one of the main challenges regarding them. First of all, I see that, for example, in terms of the first time, which will be take direct control of the AI system. One way to achieve this, will be for adversaries to directly take control of the AI system, and they can decide what outputs the system generates and what decisions it makes. The second type will be the so-called adversarial machine learning, which means that actually the AI system makes mistakes, so a cyber attacker manipulates the input of an AI system to make it ignore, for example, specific signs, alarms, or symbols or objects that the AI system it has been developed and has been trained to detect. And the third type will be the data poisoning that I think that most of us know here in this event. The data poisoning happens when adversaries train an AI model on inaccurate and mislabeled data. So in this regard, even if there are different ways of using AI to deter a cyber attack, or there are cyber tools which may be useful to for example, update or wake up an AI system, the problem is that, for example, even if you make an AI model really robust and really defendable from data poisoning and adversarial cyber attacks, one of the main problems is that if the malicious actor that is deploying a specific cyber attack on AI is able to enter into the sensitive data that drives the more robust AI system to prevent these cyber attacks, one of the main problems is that the cyber attacker will be able to access new data, new sensitive data, a new set of security risks. And actually, this is a real hard challenge in terms of, so when you are trying to develop a new AI system or a new cyber defense model, which aims to protect your either AI system or cyber framework. So if a cyber attacker is able to enter into it, again, there is a new layer of risks. So in this regard, one of the main challenges that I see is not only the technical side of things, it's especially the institutional learning and the institutional coordination between different departments, ministries, governments, agencies. For example, if we look at the 2018 report from a French a parliamentary representative, which is titled For a Meaningful AI Towards a French and European Strategy, what we see is that this French report knocks the door to the country and says to France, here we need not only a specific strategy on AI or a specific strategy on cybersecurity as such, we need specific mechanisms, protocols, guidelines, and safety and security risks to integrate the design phase of AI systems and the vulnerabilities which may arise from cyber attacks. So in this line, it is important to have always in mind the nexus between AI and cyber attacks, not only from the technical perspective, but especially from the institutional side. Why? Because here I always feel that when I talk with public representatives, concretely public officers and so on, politicians, in Europe, but also in the United States, when I lived there, one of the main problems is that, in terms of the AI cyber nexus, the importance of talking with plain language. And with plain language, I mean that when you are, for example, working at a specific department of energy, and you need to get to know more information on the AI and cyber nexus, one of the main problems or challenges, let's say, is that there is no straightforward communication with the correspondent agency on cyber or the correspondent center of national research or center of excellence on AI. So still there is a challenge of coordination and there is a challenge of communication in terms of plain language. So how can I communicate to a person who doesn't work in these realms how to be updated on the importance of this issue for my personal work, for energy, for education, for the healthcare system. So in this regard, the first challenge will be the use of plain language and the importance of communication. The second point will be the issue of not only developing interstate coordination, for example, now with the upcoming EU Joint Cyber Unit, which aims to make countries share information, and not only at crisis times, but also on a sustained basis. One of the main challenges with this is that when you look at the sub-state level, so for example, if you look at those countries which have regional governments, for example, in Spain, the Valencian community, Catalonia, the community of Madrid, Andalusia, etc., you see that still there is a strong challenge, which is that even if you have a national cybersecurity agency, and even if you have a center of excellence on AI, still you need the sub-state governments or public administration at the regional level to be able to understand the impact of AI and cyber in between. And the third challenge for me, and I will stop here, is how the European Union is not only working in terms of communication, in terms of technical issues, in terms of a member state interaction, but also how the European Union is harnessing its international partnerships to try to reframe the risks from the AI and cyber nexus. So for example, let's imagine the case of the Trade and Technology Council between the European Union and the United States. We see that for now, cybersecurity is not part of the priorities of the Trade and Tech Council. For example, AI is. So artificial intelligence actually is one of the 4 top-tier priorities from the first meeting in Pittsburgh in the US back in September, at the end of September. So we see that, for example, if the United States and the European Union decide to work more further on AI, still they will need a sort of cooperation on how AI and cyber interact, and not only through the cyber dialogues which happen between both sides for a long time, also on the nexus between AI and cyber at the level of the Trade and Tech Council in terms of joint risk mapping. So perhaps the European Union and the United States do not aim to work collaboratively in terms of crisis response to a cyber attack which has deployed an AI system in a nuclear grid or in an electrical grid, but maybe there may be possibilities for cooperation in terms of joint risk mapping or threat analysis. And with this, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel Jorge. While you were speaking, we've lost Mr. Kokorich, but I think we have gained Dr. Rytis. Dr. Rytis, welcome. Dr. Rytis is the Director of National Cybersecurity Center at the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. Those points of Ms. Jorge are quite useful and does bring home the challenges faced by the West, by the US and EU. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out the ethics and how to cooperate at all those state levels. We have other actors in the world who can act more effectively and without less need for transparency and democracy, and that is a challenge that's facing us. Mr. Janota, you want to step in, take the floor?
Okay. I was thinking about we are working in cyber. For the cybersecurity, from my perspective, AI has a lot of advantages, of course. Firstly, we are working with a huge amount of data, trying to identify within the data different informations which are not basically based on signatures. The signature principle is not really something which works anymore. So using of machine learning and neural systems specifically for pattern detections to identify significant patterns is quite unique. But of course, there is a lot of other possibilities. AI learns more over time, help us identify unknown threats, analyze behavior patterns within the data, etc. Of course, at the end, AI for us is not a tool which make independent decisions. It's just the help for the analytics to make decisions on the human level. So at least currently, we do not face any direct related risks from misuse of AI, risk coming from, for instance, wrong decisions leading to damages or something similar. On the other side, of course, we should work with data we have available. So we can't really decide what kind of input data we may use for detection of future or existing incidents. So the probability of good decision basically done only on AI level is not very high. So for me, it's more pre-processing of the amount of the data, searching for information which with the human brain we are not easily able to identify, but the decision is on the human level, basically. On the other side, of course, AI is used by attackers as well. We see currently increasing amount of attacks where AI could be one of the techniques used by the attackers. There is in some cases quite variable amount of the source code, the attacker code for the same purpose. It's visible that somebody is really using technology which generate different type of attacking techniques for the same purpose, for instance, and the amount is quite high. Luckily, good implementation of AI is still quite expensive on both sides, including attacker side. So still, the importance of this kind of attacks is not high, but I'm very much afraid that it will change over the time, maybe even pretty soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Janota. I'm curious to learn more about how you think that there's no risk from AI making wrong decisions, but maybe that's for later on in the discussion. Mr. Mikhail Kokorich, you have the floor. Good to see you back, by the way.
Yes. Thank you for inviting to this discussion, because somehow it's actually a very important discussion for almost anybody who is developing autonomous way of transportation. And in a Destinus, we are developing this fastest aircraft capable basically of autonomous flight between the continents within 1-2 hours. It's a hybrid between an aeroplane and a rocket. We call it hyperplane. So we basically targeting freight transportation, later passenger transportation with a hydrogen as a fuel. So in any transport system that doesn't have a human, we need to have somehow decision-making system. And actually, for example, in aviation, the decision-making system is used for a long time. It's called autopilot. So autopilot, it's an expert system that basically operates based on the rules that was embedded to the system by a human. The difference between expert system like autopilot and AI system is that expert system is deterministic. So we can put all the situations in the system and basically make a programming of the response of the system, what to do in this situation or in this situation. AI system can be used when situation is really undeterministic, when the variety of the options, like in driving with a car on the streets, you cannot program anything. And actually, when you get rid of the pilot plane, also you cannot predict anything. You have different weather patterns, you have traffic, you have human errors, you have traffic control, you have many, you have failures of your system. So situation cannot be determined before. So the AI need to make almost a human decision what to do. So the situation is moving from predictable situation, where you have autopilot responsible for predictable situation, or unpredictable, you have a human in the cockpit, to unpredictable situation, how to deal with unpredictable situation. And this will be a lot of I would say, regulatory and ethical problem, how to deal with this. And I think when we humanize this decision support system, we finally end up still going to this ethic rules that will be cornerstone, or actually for AI also. And whenever it will be ethic rules, for example, from Isaac Asimov, 3 robot rules, that robot may not injure a human being or through inaction, or allow human being come to harm. So, and this will be very important, because this eventually, the ethic rules in an AI system will be the single protection for cybersecurity. You will not be able to defend on cybersecurity. Finally, any cybersecurity can be broken. I mean, with conventional computers, with the quantum computers, with the human errors. And the last defense will be actually with the AI system. That we will need to make a human decision based on the ethic and see what actually was interaction. And it creates a lot of a really regulatory problem. If, for example, it will be ordered to do something bad, the system will make a decision, no, I will not do these bad things. So it's actually very interesting how to do it, especially with us, because we will be flying at some part of the flight, basically in a cloud of plasma, where it will be no even communication with the vehicle. So there are no way that you can communicate and help do this or that. You need to be making a decision. Cars the same. I mean, you cannot predict that always you have connectivity. So cars need to make a decision in some moment only by themselves. So I think it's a cornerstone will be ethic, like for human, and for AI and for cybersecurity, the ethical rules that embedded in the system will be the last level of defense for most everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kokorich. We had Mr. Rytis, but he's gone again. So we'll open the floor to questions. Is there anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question? I'm trying to see if there are any on Slido right now. I don't see any. The hashtag AI and cyber. I can ask one just to kick things off. And this is partly directed at you, Mr. Janota, and partly directed at Raquel. Maybe you can address it first, Raquel. Because the data sources and the people who select the data can bias AI, there will inevitably be times when AI makes mistakes. It gets wrong because it's biased. What are the implications of these types of errors, and who should be liable, who should be responsible? And if I'm affected negatively, if I suffer, would I have a right to be compensated by the harm caused by that AI? Of course, I'm thinking like a lawyer here now because that's my background. And if so, who should be responsible? Is it the owner or the person who programmed that AI, or a mixture of the two? Raquel? Were you able to hear that?
Just to try to understand, are you asking question, what do you think should be the rules for the responsibility of AI making decisions? This is a very interesting question, and actually I think we should look at the humans. When human is making mistake is possible, yeah, like we are doing mistakes, and then the system, like the Howey's law is created. So if this human was properly educated and taught and certified, then mistake happens, it happens. And if it's like an unintentional mistake, there are some, some treatment that is like much weaker in case if it's intentional mistake. I think for AI is the same. It would be almost impossible to create a progress if we put responsibility for any traffic accident to, for example, the car company that produced the cars, because this company will become bankrupt immediately. Yeah, if you put like a start to sue this company for all the mistakes, it's basically, I think it will be impossible. It should be certificational that show that AI reacting good enough in the majority of the cases. And then if in some cases, unfortunately, mistake happened, then mistake happened. Then like it should be limited responsibility for this, like for human. It cannot be unlimited responsibility only because it's corporation owns this algorithm, not the human bit.
I can see the insurance companies having great fun working that out, all right? So basically what you're saying is that the individual owner of the car who turns on the AI and then that AI causes an accident, that individual owner has to carry the risk, and it's insurer rather than the manufacturer of the AI that went into the car. And that is a position, I guess, that we'll see work its way through the courts and everything and be developed. Does anyone else, Mr. Rytis is trying to join by Slido, but I don't see a question from him there. Raquel, do you want to intervene? I see your hand raised there. Raquel,
yes, well, I wanted to talk a bit about your question and also add to Mikhail and what he said. I think that indeed the AI systems repeat the biases which exist in society as such in real life. But I think that at the same time, one of the main challenges with AI systems is that as long as you put into the system a specific number of data, specific reality of data, you may accelerate some, for example, inequalities. I mean, in the same way in which you can accelerate benefits, you can accelerate as well other inequalities. So, for example, if you look at the proposal of the AI Act by the European Union institutions, you see that, for example, when you look at the content of the regulation as such, so I sometimes miss a bit of further scope on the specific aspect of acceptable risk. So, because if you look at the proposal, you will see that there are only 3 lines explaining what a risk is not acceptable as such. So the proposal gives you 2 specific examples on toys for children and etc. But actually, the risk when it is unacceptable, there is no further explanation on it. And for example, when it comes down to the specific specifically the point of high-risk applications of AI. It defines, for example, critical infrastructure, or it defines migration and border management issues. But still, one of the main vacuums or policy vacuums which may exist is the fact that each member state has its own definition of critical infrastructure. So depending on whether a country defines, for example, a specific infrastructure as critical, the prohibition or the definition of high-risk AI application will be implemented or not. So I see that in this regard, indeed, there are some biases which exist in society which are automatically repeated in AI systems, but at the same time, I think that the AI system may accelerate other issues, either for good or for bad. And so in that regard, I wanted just to highlight these specific details on the proposal of the AI Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Mr. Janota, would you like to add something to that, or Mr. Kokorich? Well, that feeds nicely into my next question, and that is actually, you talked about policy vacuums and the nomenclature and how we're going to kind of potentially regulate all of this. And of course, regulation in technology in the last 30 or 40 years has notoriously been behind the curve, and there's a risk if we do regulate and regulate too much in the Western sphere that other spheres will steal a march and get ahead of us in the development of AI, and that may leave us ultimately way, way behind. So the question to you, the panel, is what role do you see of regulation actually having? Is government regulation necessary? And if so, should we have a lot of it and try to cover all of the ethical questions? Or are we past the point where laws can actually meaningfully restrict the malicious behavior that could be linked to the deployment of AI? Mr. Janota? Do we need more law or less law?
Yeah, okay. The regulation in the AI area is necessary, definitely. Currently, there is a process of preparation, maybe future regulation within that this topic. We had quite extensive discussions in Slovakia about the topic. Unfortunately, as we all know, we have, for instance, guns very much regulated. On the other side, the bad guys are always having access to the guns via different ways. So we should be careful with regulation to the extent that by very extensive or too extensive regulation, we might limit good use for the good guys. And on the other side, we might have problem with the bad guys who would use artificial intelligence anyway, with or without regulation, to their purposes. So it's sensitive. It's necessary to work on the topic. It's definitely necessary to have a regulation to limit bad or not fair use of artificial intelligence. We now see in some areas where artificial intelligence is already in use, that decisions relying only on a proposal from the artificial intelligence side, with current quality of the implementations, is quite often combining with the quite huge amount of false negative or false positive decisions. And organizations using AI are not usually implemented good way how to disagree or check the decisions done by artificial intelligence from the human side. So I guess there is a lot of activities we need to do. Luckily, within the AI field, I am a bit optimistic in a way that the discussion on AI started quite soon. So still, AI is not very advanced technology for this purpose, so we can really do good regulation and eliminate risk of damages coming from not regulated period for this very sensitive technology.
Yeah, your notion of having a bit more oversight and regulation in that respect certainly chimes with me. On a personal level, I was kicked off Twitter by AI because of a certain use of a combination of words. Won't get into it here. And I was allowed to appeal it, and my appeal was reviewed by AI, and I was only given like 200 characters to do the appeal, and it also wasn't accepted. So Twitter and I parted ways last February, and that's the way it is. But regulation of AI from that perspective, it kind of could make sense. I've been told that we do have Dr. Rytis, but only on audio, not on video. So I would turn the question to you, Mr. Rytis, if you're still with us, if you'd like to address us on the question about whether or not we need more regulation or less regulation in the field of AI and cybersecurity. Dr.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you hear me, and I apologize not be able to turn my video on. It's late evening in Lithuania, and currently I'm out of office. But hope you can hear me well.
We hear you
and
clear.
Thank you for an opportunity to speak on behalf of the National Cybersecurity Center of Lithuania, where we actually are a kind of users of currently artificial intelligence systems in our next generation intrusion detection system. In Lithuania at the moment, we are having critical infrastructures covered, approximately 60% of them covered with intrusion detection systems, with the sensors. And a couple of years ago, we established a research and development division with the task to develop next generation sensor that could be able to work with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. And at the moment, right now, we successfully implemented this task, and we are having a testing version of the next generation sensors that are already first example in a network of the governmental critical infrastructure systems and monitoring. So we are users of artificial intelligence systems in the sensors. We are facing quite a lot of challenge with that approach. While it was quite a promising to add artificial intelligence system on a sensor that theoretically is allowing to detect anomalies and cyber incidents in critical infrastructure on a much higher level. But the reality is that our next generation sensor is improving detection of the cyber anomaly, cyber incident by 14%. 14. So not a lot from one side. From other side is that even this improvement is very valuable. We improved our machine learning algorithms with improvements and machine learning processes that is allowing to do that quality jump, increase of the ability to detect more hidden anomalies in the traffic, which is very important when we are defending critical infrastructure. That's one of the one of the topic that I wanted to stress. Another one is, as one of you already expressed the challenge we are facing with artificial intelligence system itself with a necessity to defend machine learning algorithm from the interruption of the malicious actors to inputs poisoning, as we are saying, poisoning data to the machine learning algorithm to make it bad teaching. Yeah, if machine algorithms will be taught in a wrong way, then the detections of the anomalies will not be able to produce good results. And that's perhaps the second topic, this regulation in that regard of artificial intelligence system, how to properly defend them, could be the area of possible regulation. Well, that's my thoughts, and I will stop there with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rytis, and some of your remarks there do chime with those of Raquel Jorge and Mr. Janota in the terms of data being poisoned. We also talk about data bias, and the two are related, and of course regulation dealing with transparency then becomes more and more important to that. We should maybe turn to a question from Slido. We have one regarding the training of personnel. Do we need to have more personnel trained in the field, and what efforts are being deployed to do that? And should we turn more to the public sector for the training of those personnel from the military side and from the civil defense side, or should it be something that comes from the private sector? Maybe Mr. Kokorich, you want to address that?
If I correctly heard the question, because it's a little bit noisy, your question is how we should implement the testing through the military or civil side of the algorithms.
How should we get more trained personnel? Should we rely on the public sector to educate and train them, or should we rely on the private sector, the market, to generate those personnel, or a combination of both?
I am a proponent of always relying on a private sector with self-regulated organizations, with experts, finally for many companies to make expert opinions or make certification of different AI algorithms. The same way we are certifying the drivers. How we certify the drivers? We just pass them through the exam, and we can do the same with the AI algorithm, except for it will be much more rigorous, include many more cases. And I think finally it's better to use private expert organizations which will be responsible, having insurance for proper processes, and not go with a DMV. I don't think DMV is good quality. So we should avoid government regulation as much as possible and rather give it to self-regulated organizations.
Spoken like an entrepreneur. Raquel Jorge, what's your view? Where should we get these highly skilled personnel from? From government programs or from the private sector?
Yes, I think that on this debate there are two lines of work. The first one will be how to skill people, generally speaking, and the second point will be how to reskill people. And reskilling is a really important asset for both cybersecurity professionals and AI professionals, especially because perhaps within a company there are people which have senior management positions, but perhaps due to the age as such, they do not have a strong in-depth professional experience and expertise on cyber or on AI. So with that point, it is really important to foster reskilling and upskilling. For example, in the case of Brazil and in the case of Mexico, these are two really interesting countries because they are part of the Latin American and Caribbean countries region, but they are they are both countries most advanced in terms of cyber maturity within the region, right? So, for example, in the case of Brazil, what they are doing is to try to foster a personal workforce expertise in the cyber and AI nexus from the private companies where they work at. For example, in the case of Mexico, they are trying to foster a public-led training programs for people, so that, for example, they engage, so that they have a specific target groups. So, for example, women, or for example, they have people over 45 years old. So in this line, there are several realms on how to promote both upskilling and reskilling. And in the case of Europe, one of the main points is the lack of incentives in some member states to stay within the country working on cyber or on AI because of the salary issue. For example, if you go to the United States, when I lived there, I remember that I heard from people that most people, first of all, gain experience within the federal government, and once they get this really important and strong experience, they go to the private sector because they have higher salaries. And in the case of Europe, it's quite similar, the situation. The situation is quite similar. And the problem here is that governments need to analyze how they may retain people within the public government and how they can interact. So how they can exchange experience and expertise and best practices with the private sector, so that people working in the private sector and people working in the public one feel that actually they are working together, because in some countries this problem happens.
Certainly cooperation between both sectors is really important, especially given the threats we face from outside, from other regions of the world which are not democratic. To move on to, maybe to close up, because we've only got a few minutes left, we've seen how disinformation and fake news have caused problems within our democracies. Do we think that that's a form of cybersecurity and cybersecurity threats in its own right, affecting real-world outcomes? Can AI and machine learning help us fight back at scale? Does any of you have a view on that? Anybody? Or to wrap up, when we have a sufficiently functioning quantum computer, when it emerges, and there are in the lab quantum computers that are active and productive, how can we prepare in advance existing security infrastructure for the change towards quantum computing? I think Mr. Kokorich, you mentioned quantum computing earlier on.
So I think the nearest problem that we can face with a quantum computer is that the cryptography will not exist. So we'll basically lose any existing cryptography mechanisms, and we cannot always use like a quantum distributed key. I mean, it will be very difficult to defend things. So in this case, the edge AI decision system will be probably the last level of defense to really make it. So it's like a human. I mean, if you have human, finally, if you have two humans, because as we know that one human can become metal, so they collapse the plane. But if you have like some humanized intelligence that guided by ethical rules, this can be defended. And I think this is a way where we finally go, when especially the cryptography will not be anymore the last defense like it's now.
Okay, thank you very much. Then to close, does anyone have any final remarks before we close the session and take a break before we start the next session? Well, in that case, I might sum up. We've heard from Raquel Jorge from the Elcano Institute, Mr. Janota from the Slovakian Cyber Defense Institute, Mr. Rytis, Dr. Rytis from the Cybersecurity Center of the Lithuanian Ministry of National Defense, and Mr. Mikhail Kokorich, CEO and founder of Destinus. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the audience here. This will be recorded and available on YouTube. We will be informed afterwards, and there will be a summary produced and shared with everybody who's registered. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So 5 minutes and we'll restart.